So what's the difference between vulnerability versus leading with vulnerability or being a vulnerable leader? Vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have. It could be a gap in understanding. It could be a gap in competence. It could be something you're struggling with, a challenge. It's exposing a gap that you have. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing the gap that you have, but then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close that gap. Now, in the context of work, the relationships that you have in a work environment, this is crucial. Because if you just show up to work every day talking about and exposing the gaps that you have, then over time, people are going to look at you and they're going to say, maybe this isn't a good fit. But if you can expose the gaps that you have and demonstrate what you're trying to do to close those gaps, then the perception that other people have of you changes. So a very simple example that we see, you're given a project at work. You mess up. We all mess up. I make mistakes with my team makes mistakes with me all the time. I'm not saying you should never make a mistake. You should feel safe to talk about that mistake, but instead of just saying, hey, I'm so sorry I messed this up, I made a mistake, I know how important this was, I'm really sorry.
Do you want to hear something really crazy? 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. It'll literally take you 1 second, and you'll get notified when more videos just like this one are available. Now, let's get back to the content.
Instead of just being vulnerable, add the leadership piece to this. I'm so sorry I made a mistake. Here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. Here are 3 things I'm going to do going forward to make sure that mistake does not happen again. Vulnerability plus leadership. This is what being a vulnerable leader is all about. A vulnerable leader is a leader who potentially, intentionally exposes themselves to the potential of emotional harm, but while taking action to create a positive outcome when possible. So again, a vulnerable leader is someone who intentionally opens themselves up to the potential of emotional harm while taking action to create a positive outcome when possible. The definition of vulnerability in the dictionary is exposing yourself to the potential of physical or emotional harm. Now, for most of us in this room, the physical aspect is not as relevant, so the emotional aspect of harm. This means maybe you share something that a coworker can use against you, right? You're on a team and you're doing a project and you go to your peers and you say, honestly, I've never done this before. I'm kind of nervous, right? That's exposing yourself to the potential of emotional harm. Somebody on your team, if they wanted to, could take that information, go to your boss and say, I don't know why you put this person on the team. They just told me they'd never done this before. Not a good idea, right? So you're exposing yourself in some way. So again, being a vulnerable leader is you do that, but you try to take action when you can to create that positive outcome. Now, if there's one thing that I hope you take away from anything today, it is this, the vulnerable leader equation. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. I interviewed over 100 CEOs at companies around the world and surveyed 14,000 employees at companies around the world to put together some of the research that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So a lot of what I'm talking about isn't just my opinion. It's backed by data, backed by the interviews that I did. And when you guys get a copy of the book, you'll see all of that in there, including stories and examples from the CEOs themselves in their own words about what this means and how to put it into practice. So leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. Now, I mentioned I surveyed 14,000 employees. That was done in partnership with a research firm called DDI. And one of the things that we looked at are the frequency of effective leadership behaviors. So the most effective leaders in the world, they have these 13 behaviors that they use, these 13 behaviors. Now, what's fascinating about this is that if you look at the bottom 3, the effective leadership behaviors that we are practicing least often in our organizations, inquires and cares about my well-being, genuinely acknowledges failures and shortcomings, and by far at the very bottom of the list, shows a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable. Now, another interesting thing that you might notice if you look at this, and I group this into traditional versus emerging leadership behaviors. Traditional leadership behaviors are things that you can expect, right? For example, number 1 on the list, maintains high trust and confidentiality. That's a very traditional leadership attribute, something that's been around for a long time. Whereas showing a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable is a relatively new or emerging leadership attribute and behavior. So we broke these up into emerging and leadership attributes. And what we found is that when we look at different seniority levels, the more senior you become in an organization, the less frequently you practice these emerging leadership behaviors. Now, that alone is interesting, but when we look at specifically when it comes to showing a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable, we see that there's a huge drop when we look at the difference between mid-level leaders and senior level leaders. In other words, the more senior you become inside of your organization, the less you are willing to be emotionally vulnerable. And this takes a huge drop when you go from being a mid-level leader to being a senior level leader. Massive, massive drop. So think about that. How many employees around the world work for an organization where their leaders are not genuinely inquiring about their well-being? They're not willing to talk about their mistakes and challenges and failures. They're not willing to show any kind of emotional vulnerability. Seems like a pretty difficult and a scary place to work. I mean, especially when we think about the digital workplace, right? You want to, even in a digital environment, be able to work with a leader where you have that sense of connection and relationship, where you know that your leaders are checking in on you. This has been especially true over the past few years as so many people were working virtually and remotely. Now let's talk a little bit about the benefit, the ROI of leading with vulnerability. So there are a couple things. One is in organizations where leaders are displaying vulnerability often or always when appropriate, the leaders in those organizations are perceived as being much higher quality. Not only that, but we see a gradual increase as we go from not at all or rarely to sometimes to often to always. So in organizations where leaders are always vulnerable when appropriate, those leaders are seen as much more higher quality as opposed to in organizations where leaders are never leading with vulnerability. Couple more stats for you, and I won't go through all of these, but just so you can see some of the ones that are up there. In organizations where leaders are comfortable and they're showing a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable, we see higher levels of trust, higher levels of engagement, higher levels of innovation, creating a more inclusive culture where people with different ideas and backgrounds and cultures can come together. So we see a lot of ROI here in terms of the business impact that that brings to the organization. Now, if you were to think of these two attributes overlaid, leadership and vulnerability, competence and connection, it's important to understand how these two pieces play a role together. So if you look at this quadrant in front of you, you kind of imagine the relationship between leadership and vulnerability, again, competence and connection. If you only focus on the vulnerability aspect, in other words, you're really good at connecting with people, you're really good at building those relationships, somebody might work for you and say, well, you know, I have this great relationship with Jacob. We have good chemistry, we're able to collaborate on things. I just really enjoy working with him. But I'm not sure he's the right leader for the team. He hasn't demonstrated competence. Similarly, if you're only good at the leadership piece, somebody might say, Jacob is awesome at his job. He's bringing in a lot of deals, he's bringing in a lot of business, he's really growing the team, growing the function, but I don't really feel motivated or engaged or inspired working with and for Jacob. I don't feel that sense of chemistry, the collaboration just isn't there. So this is why it's important to have both of those things, leadership and vulnerability, competence and connection. And that's ideally where you want to be on that top right quadrant. The bottom left, this is where we see relatively new employees. They haven't really picked a path yet. And what's fascinating is that most employees get into a leadership role at some point in their mid-20s, right? Maybe you're in a store and you're put in a leadership role, you're supervising maybe 3 to 4 or 5 people. On average, in our mid-20s is when we first get our experience of leadership. We don't get any formal leadership training until we're in our mid to late 30s, sometimes even our early 40s. So there's a period of 10, 15, sometimes even 20 years where employees are leading teams where they were never actually taught how to lead. And in that kind of environment, which path do you think the employee is going to take? They're going to take the path that is reflected in the culture of the organization. So if you have an organization that only prioritizes the competence piece, that only prioritizes making money and closing deals, then that's the type of leader your employee is going to become. This is why I always tell organizations one of the best things that you can do is to give everyone access to leadership training. Don't just wait for the employee to have to earn it. Why wouldn't you want everyone to think and act and be like a leader inside of your organization? Now, there's an important relationship here between employees and leaders of organizations. There's an implicit and an explicit relationship. The explicit relationship is that employees are dependent upon, they're dependent to, and they're vulnerable to their leaders. Because as a leader, you can fire your employees if you want. You can demote them. You can make their life hell at work. You can give them all sorts of unpleasant projects if you wanted to. So your employees depend on you, and they're already vulnerable to you. Which means that as a leader inside of your organization, you have the upper hand. And in fact, a lot of leaders assume that the more senior they become, the more their employees need to trust them, but the leaders don't need to reciprocate that trust. So what does leading with vulnerability do? Well, it means that there's also an implicit relationship, because as a leader inside of your organization, you are also dependent on your people. Because if they don't do a good job, who does it reflect poorly on? It reflects poorly on you, on your team, on your function. So you as a leader are also dependent on your people, which means you are also vulnerable to your people. The difference is we don't talk about that relationship, right? How often do you see leaders saying, you know what, I couldn't have done this without you? Instead, we see that other relationship where employees are dependent and vulnerable to their leaders, but the truth is that you are dependent and vulnerable to your employees. So when you lead with vulnerability, what that does is it levels the playing field. And when you level the playing field, what happens? You open up innovation, collaboration, trust, productivity, all of these things that are so crucial to leading, to working in this world that we're all a part of, especially when you think about the digital workplace.